Hello, I'm Dennis Stoley, the head of applied psychology for the American Psychological Association. I want to welcome all of you to today's webinar, Leveraging Psychology to Drive Pro-Environmental Behavior Change. The American Psychological Association is delighted to be collaborating on this webinar with the World Wildlife Fund and the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology, which is Division 34 of the APA. Before we get started with today's session, I want to share a few quick announcements. Today's session is being recorded. In about 2 or 3 weeks after our live session, everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording, the slides, and a transcript. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed by the panelists in this webinar are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the American Psychological Association or the World Wildlife Fund. This is the third in a series of webinars jointly hosted by APA, WWF, and Division 34 on nature, forests, and psychological science. These webinars reflect APA's dedication to bringing psychological science to bear on issues of sustainability, responsible human decision-making, and responsible human behavior regarding our natural environment. And I'm delighted that we are joined today by Althea Skinner, WWF's Director of Inclusive Conservation. Welcome, Althea.
Thanks, Dennis, for your warm welcome. For those unfamiliar with WWF, we're a leading conservation organization operating in 100 countries with 5 million supporters globally. Our work includes helping local communities to conserve the natural resources they depend on, transforming markets and policies towards sustainability, and protecting and restoring species and their habitats. It also includes efforts to conserve forests and freshwater in ways that improve human health. As the Director of Inclusive Conservation, I support our teams to engage the widest possible cross-section of actors, from local communities and civil society organizations to governments, corporations, and research institutions. WWF understands such inclusive conservation approaches as critical to achieving our vision of a future where people live in harmony with nature. That's why I'm so thrilled to be collaborating with APA and Division 34 on this series of webinars. The first two webinars did an excellent job of demonstrating the value of forests to psychological health. Today, we'll also hear about water because forests help to regulate freshwater ecosystems, with more than 50% of US drinking water originating in forested lands. I'm very excited that this final webinar is tackling the value of psychological science to forest conservation. Understanding people's values, beliefs, preferences, and motivations couldn't be more critical to WWF's work, since many successful conservation efforts hinge on people changing their day-to-day behaviors that affect the environment. With that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to our moderator, Beth Carlin, who's both an expert at the nexus of behavior change and sustainability and a lot of fun. Over to you, Beth.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all. As Althea said, I work at this nexus of climate change and behavior change. So I'm really excited to invite three amazing colleagues to talk to you. Just a couple quick notes. We have a lot of introductory, so I'm going to keep it quick. I just want to say a few quick things. One, this audience is a combination of people with a background of APA members, with a background in psychology, and WWF staff, so people who have a much stronger background in conservation. So these speakers have a very difficult job of speaking to folks in both groups. So if you feel like they're either saying something a little over your head and you don't understand, ask a clarifying question. We're going to try and save a couple minutes for, because I know I'm a psychologist, we sometimes use jargony words and we don't mean to, oopsie. So if there's something you don't get, throw that in, don't be afraid. We're going to ask a couple clarifying questions after each speaker, and then at the very end, we'll be opening up for a broader Q&A and discussion with all three. Many of you already submitted questions when you registered. Thank you. We have those. We're prepared to ask them. We are hoping to hold space for questions that come up in real time as well. So you have a Q&A function. Please use that if questions come up. Again, if it's a clarifying question, we'll try and answer it right after each talk. And then anything that's more substantive, we're going to save some time at the end. So don't hop off as soon as the last speaker finishes, unless you have to. We have lives. But we're going to get into a really rich discussion. Those are always my favorite parts. The other thing you are welcome to do, a couple of you have already done it, you're welcome to do during the session. We don't have an open chat, but we do have reactions. So if somebody says something that you think is great, throw them a heart, throw them a smiley, I don't know what is down there, thumbs up. Feel free to give them love. One of the things about being virtual is we don't see each other's faces, so thank you for that. So feel free to do that when our speakers are speaking. After each one, I might ask for a round of applause. You can throw those reactions up to give them a virtual one. So we're going to try and be as connected as we can on our screens all over the world, as I understand. This is a global audience. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can also message that throughout the Q&A tool. I will not help you at all. I'm awful at technology, but there are tech people on this call who will help you if you need that. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our first speaker, Sonia Sachdeva. Sonia is a computational social scientist whose work explores how human values, cultural worldviews, and collective behavior shape environmental decision-making. She uses computational methods, including natural language processing, geospatial modeling, and behavioral experiments to study the relationship between environmental stewardship, social equity, and community resilience in the face of climate change. Her research has informed sustainable forest management, wildfire risk modeling, and climate adaptation strategies across the public and private sectors. So a lot of work that is very related to a lot of people on this call. And just to remind us that we're people in addition to our jobs, fun fact, Sonia also helps organize the Chicago South Asian Film Festival every September, bringing stories of identity, justice, and community to the big screen. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to talk to us about values.
I'm still muted. Well, thank you. This is such an incredible turnout, and what a wonderful series of webinars organized by APA and WWF. This is fantastic. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, which is always a bit dicey, so please let me know if
It looks great.
everything
We're all
looks
set, Sonia.
okay. Awesome. Well, again, thank you all so much for being here. Beth kind of alluded to this already, but the bulk of my work really focuses on how values shape and guide much of environmental behavior, from helping us orient to what information should be salient, how we interpret conflict. And as a consequence, values really do affect how successful different sorts of interventions can be in the environmental domain. My background is a bit of a hodgepodge, and you'll see that reflected in the talk as well. So I'm going to be drawing on research from cultural psychology and behavioral science, and of course, a lot of the computational modeling that Beth alluded to. So just to lay a bit of the groundwork, I kind of really rely on this cognitive hierarchical model when I think about values. And in this particular approach, values are the foundation upon which all of these other sorts of components of cognition, so attitudes, beliefs, norms, are all built. And what makes values different from those other sorts of components is that they are relatively few in number, and they tend to be quite stable across time. And that stability is really what makes values especially important when we're trying to understand persistent patterns in environmental decision making. And unlike attitudes and beliefs, which are already difficult to change, values are even more core. They're early formed and they're deeply held, and they are resistant to change in a lot of ways. And so that's why understanding values is so critical, because they really structure our sense of what matters, and that's shaped pretty early on. In the environmental domain, we've often seen value orientations organized across this kind of bipolar spectrum, from anthropocentric values to biocentric values. So on the anthropocentric end, nature is a resource for human use. And this perspective underlies a lot of US natural resource policy, right? So I come from the Forest Service world, and Gifford Pinchot, as a founder of the Forest Service, oftentimes exemplifies this anthropocentric value where forests are important because they provide us with clean water and clean air, and that's wonderful. But it's a much more how do we see nature as impacting human life? On the other end of the spectrum is more of a biocentric orientation, and oftentimes John Muir is supposed to be kind of the poster child for this perspective, where nature is seen to have intrinsic value, valuable in and of its own self, independent of what utility it provides for humans. And a lot of psychological frameworks like VBN, value belief norm theory, which is developed by Paul Stern and colleagues, kind of expand on this and tie these different value orientations to pro-environmental behaviors. As part of some of the work that we did that was UN sponsored, it was the IPBES panel, which is about biodiversity and ecosystem services. We actually sampled from over 50,000 sources, including peer-reviewed science, policy documents, a lot of indigenous and local knowledge. We actually found that, believe it or not, unlike so many of the other psychological domains which happen to fall across this dichotomy, values are much more complex than just this anthropocentric, biocentric continuum. And in fact, they represent multiple coexisting perspectives, which may all overlap, they may conflict, or they may even reinforce each other in different contexts. So we identified instrumental values and intrinsic values, but we also found relational values in the literature and holistic values. And importantly, we found that not only do people express and hold all of these types of values simultaneously, things like instrumental and intrinsic values, which are seen as polar opposite in the broader literature, are actually not so at all. They can coexist within the same person. And so recognizing that value pluralism is really key in my mind if we want to design environmental policies that are effective. And I want to also talk about one other important component of why values matter. So as we look at the plurality of values in the environmental domain, and we think about how values are so core to how we make sense of the world, a lot of the environmental conflicts that we observe, if viewed through this kind of value conflict or contested values lens, they make much more sense. So like everything from offshore wind farms to pipeline construction to fishing practices to conserving old growth forests can have a value basis around it, right? And that leads to different ways of construing the situation. Are we valuing aesthetics over energy sufficiency? Are we thinking about sovereignty or economic growth? And so you can already start to see, I hope, that unless policymakers account for these underlying values in navigating through this environmental conflict, they risk not just disagreement with those policies, but deep mistrust and opposition. And so one example I want to get into a bit more today comes from some of the work that we did with the Ganga River in India. So a lot of you are probably aware of this river already, but in case you're not, to many, especially within Hindu communities, the Ganga is a literal living goddess. It's a sacred force that has immense purifying and healing powers. So people ritually bathe in it, they give offerings to it, and cremation rites obviously are a huge part of the sacred worldview that surrounds Ganga Ma, Mother Ganga, as she is known. And further, in this sacred framing, the Ganga is seen as eternal and self-cleansing. So its purity is not something that can actually be compromised by material pollutants like you see in this image here. And then you can contrast that with a kind of like secular or environmental lens, where the Ganga River is a river. It's a freshwater ecosystem, and it's subject to the same kinds of pollution and degradation that we see in any other river. So in this case, we're able to recognize industrial waste, raw sewage, bacterial contamination, all of that terrible stuff. And in that worldview, the river is fragile and deteriorating and is in urgent need of human intervention. And so these are not just different opinions, right? They're different worldviews, they're different epistemologies, and they come with all sorts of different belief systems and different value systems. And those value systems can really influence how people see and perceive environmental risk. And that's exactly what we found over the course of 3 studies. We did online surveys, online experiments, and even field experiments. And across all 3 of those studies, we found that the more sacred participants viewed the Ganga as, the less polluted they believed it was. And strikingly, in the field experiment, what we did was we actually recruited participants either as they were engaging with the river in a sacred context. So like just walking up to people after they had emerged from their ritual bathing in the morning, or engaging with them in a secular context. So people washing their dishes on the shore of the Ganga. And even this subtle manipulation, we found that same result, that the sacred framing really altered how people perceived that same environmental condition. So when people emerged after taking a ritual bath, they were less likely to state that the river was polluted. And so the sacred framing didn't just affect what they cared about, but it changed what they actually saw the river as. And when we looked more closely at the psychological mechanism behind these perceptions, we found that the biggest mediator of this relationship between sacredness and perceived environmental risk was whether or not you believed that the river could heal itself. So for people who thought that the river was self-cleaning or healing, self-healing, they really did not think that the river could pollute itself, which makes sense. And it helps explain why sacred values may not heighten environmental concern. And so if values can shape risk perception, environmental risk perception this dramatically, I think they're absolutely central to how we think about environmental policies and how environmental policies should be communicated and implemented. And so that raises a really critical governance question in my mind. And so when decisions are being made about water or forests at a national scale, like people at the Forest Service do, whose values are being considered? What sorts of values are we thinking about? And to answer that question, we actually turn to a pretty unlikely source of social science data in the public commenting process. And so for those of you that may not be familiar with this process, environmental governance in the US, at least traditionally, is supposed to be deeply participatory, right? So agencies like the Forest Service are required to solicit input, and that's mandated by laws like NEPA on any sort of proposed land management actions. So every year, agencies like the Forest Service receive hundreds of thousands of public comments, which are written by individuals and advocacy groups and tribal nations and all sorts of representation. And so oftentimes these comments are just thought of as procedural noise or just kind of regulatory stuff that we have to deal with. But actually, what we found over the course of this work is that they are profound expressions of what people really value about the natural world. In many of these comments, people are just pouring their hearts out. And so we decided to probe these comments for the underlying values that were embedded in people's words. And what we found was all sorts of values expressed, over 400,000 different public comments that we assessed. And specifically what we found was that moral and aesthetic values were more likely to be expressed in high interest projects. So suggesting that when people mobilize, so when more comments are being submitted for a given project, people are doing that from a place of deep personal meaning and not just, concerns about jobs or concerns about biological functioning. And we also found this was really interesting. So it wasn't just words like morality or spirituality that were being captured by this model. It was far deeper than that. So we could get at that strength of connection between people and the natural world. And once again, we found that people can hold both moral values and economic values at the same time, and they can say these things in a pluralistic manner. We found a lot of geographic variation, even controlling for project type, which again gets to a sense of, well, perhaps we can start to plot out a valuescape where different regions are talking about the same resources in different ways. And so I think this ultimately matters a lot because scaling up value detection is something that really hasn't been done before. Typically, when we think about values, it is on the smaller scale type of studies, like I mentioned previously, but this helps us understand the complexity and texture of public concern. And incorporating these sorts of approaches into NEPA reviews or environmental impact statements it's a broad new world to explore, and I think it will only make the process that much richer. So the final study that I want to just touch upon today is once again thinking about values at scale. So, many times in environmental psychology, as I just alluded to, we use individual level data, right? You survey a person, you get their beliefs, and you try to predict their behavior. But as we found in this work, community level moral values can oftentimes predict climate behavior, but may predict it in a different way than you would expect from individual level data. So in this work, we tested whether county level aggregates of moral values from the moral foundations theory, so predominantly things like purity or fairness, whether they could predict environmental attitudes, and also, interestingly, county level carbon emissions. And so what we found was that purity norms actually predicted lower carbon emissions on a county level, which directly contradicts a lot of the work that's been done, and some including our own, on the individual level, where we typically expect purity foundations to be tied to conservative political orientations, which are therefore tied to lower pro-environmental behavior. On a county level, we found exactly the opposite. And so this work really does suggest that community level value landscapes might be critical to study as separate from individual level, because they could often diverge very dramatically. And so to close, I want to return to a pretty simple idea that values are absolutely foundational to environmental behavior. They really do shape what we care about, shape how we perceive risk, and decide whether or not to act. And across all of these studies that I've shared, we find that values operate at multiple levels: individual, cultural, and institutional. I hope I've also demonstrated that values are pluralistic. People can have many different worldviews, and also that a lot of emerging methodology, computational methodology, that shows a lot of promise in surfacing these hidden values. I also think that unless we can start to think about these plural and diverse worldviews in our decision making, in our governance structures, we won't be able to create effective interventions. And oftentimes that means listening and collaborating and co-creating with the communities that we're meant to serve. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. Thank you. Feel free to give that virtual round of applause to Sonia. Couple quick clarifying questions before we move on to our next speaker. The first was, I'm gonna start with the second one I got in. Why do country level and individual level values diverge?
So part of what was so fascinating about that work was that we didn't expect the county level to look very different from the individual level. So we thought, you know what, carbon emissions happen. We can't really measure in a meaningful way county level or individual level carbon emissions. And we wanted to see actionable behavior. And so we were just measuring this on a county level. And this was not a hypothesized result, but this was the result that we found. And so part of the next steps are to figure out what is causing that divergence between individual level moral foundations and collective level. I have some thoughts that the collective is not just the sum of the individuals. There are some emergent properties that happen as a result of the interaction of those individuals. And I suspect that's what's causing this divergence, but we don't have any clear data to answer that as of yet.
Awesome. Your second question, how would you compare values to sensory stimulation? This person said, I find that some people have adapted to a polluted environment. For example, some people really like the smell of carbon monoxide and barbecue smoke, while others cannot even tolerate perfumes and spray odors. Any thoughts on that?
That is a very interesting question and something that I observed quite a bit as I was doing field work around the Ganga River in India. Oftentimes people would tell me these stories of um, suffering from gastrointestinal issues or having strange rashes, but they would never, so that's direct sensory input, right? But that was never directly attributed to the river because of how sacred it's perceived. Um, and so, yeah, I think values are so critical and so core to people that we are able to not see or not attribute something that's a direct sensory input to the root of our value.
And one more quick, this really is a clarifying question. And thank you for this question as a student of moral foundation theory. You specifically talked about moral values and purity. What is meant by purity values specifically in the last study?
So that is directly from Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. So purity norms, where your structure of morality values how pure or impure. Basically, morality is determined by how pure or impure you see a person, a situation, and behavior, etc.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sonia. You will get more Sonia at the end because we're going to Q&A, but now we're going to move on to our next speaker. Just a quick note, if you are like, wow, there's so much content, and if you're one of those people like me that's trying to screenshot slides, we've put in the slides so you have access to them. So if you're watching, take notes from what you're hearing, but if there's something you see on screen, you do have access to those and you don't have to wait 3 weeks. They're dropped into the chat. I know I'm like that. I'm like wanting to grab everything I can. So just so you know, that's there. Next up, we have Dr. Lauren Watkins. Lauren specializes in environmental psychology and leads a consulting practice focused on applying behavioral science to conservation and sustainability. With over 15 years of experience, Lauren partners with organizations such as the Jane Goodall Institute, which she's presenting on today, and Keeping Forests to support research, strategy, and community-based initiatives. Dr. Watkins holds degrees in psychology and natural resource management. I know we picked such perfect speakers for this webinar, right? Bringing an interdisciplinary, people-centered approach to her work. And fun fact, in addition to all the psychology work she does, Lauren also makes miniature scale models of nature scenes as a side hobby. So yes, Lauren is such a nerd. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Beth. All right, let me go ahead. And how's that looking, Beth, for my slide share?
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here and get to collaborate with two organizations that are so near and dear to my heart. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about values and practice and some case studies today from Keeping Forest and the Jane Goodall Institute of Integrating Behavioral Psychology into Forest Conservation. So I use environmental psychology and that behavioral science to help these kinds of organizations think about how they can co-create. So great segue from Sonia earlier, how we can think about getting to know audiences well enough that we can put those values very front and center into our approach and our work and our messaging. And I help with evaluating how these things are going and also building the capacity of teams to do this kind of work too. So my flow of the presentation is going to be sharing a few insights of how I've used values with the clients and teams I've supported in co-creating campaigns. I'm going to take you from Western Tanzania to South Carolina, where I'm from, to talk about two case studies, and then do a little closing with a couple reflections from my experience. So diving in first to some insights into using values to co-create messaging. The most important one, that's why I put it first, is thinking about how we can be humble and culturally responsive. So co-creation is so center, and that can look very different to what I do with teams, but it's the most important step in bringing people in very early to how we design messages and strategies, because the more relevant they are to them, the more it's going to feel like it's for them when they see it out and about in the world. And keeping in mind that change happens at the speed of trust. So having that, being aware of needing to get to know a culture and being humble about what we don't know is really important when we're designing these kinds of things. Next, we want to be really careful about the kinds of emotions we tap into and spark for people with the messaging that we select to use and create. I've found that we don't want to create false hope or positivity or toxic positivity, but we do want to steer away from fear and shame-based messaging and the kinds of campaigns that I work on, and thinking about local nuances and tailoring our efforts as much as we can to those. That helps people build those mental models where they can see themselves in the behaviors we're trying to promote people to take. And that is so key to motivating action. And finally, when I use the phrase values first messaging, it means the audience's values need to come before the conservation organization. And that can be hard. We'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. But the big takeaway here is that I try to help people get away from how do we get people to care about elephants, cheetahs, chimps, trees, to what do people already care about and how do we work with that to create mutually beneficial strategies. So let's take a look at two of these things in action. We're going to start in Western Tanzania on a project that is very near and dear to my heart that I've been working on with the Jane Goodall Institute, USAID, and a lot during my time at Impact by Design. So thank you to those partners. The issue here, I'm going to start with the problem definition, was that deforestation was drastically impacting critical chimpanzee habitat. And when I work with my clients, I try to help them think about what are all the root causes that are within our locus of control to address with our resources we have at the moment. So in this situation, I only have a few minutes to share. This was a really long process of about a year to determine what was within our control and what were the solutions going to be. But we found through baseline studies and other interactions with experts and community members, the people's soil were just really tired, and they were leaving their local plots to go farm in forests that had richer soil because this was essential. They needed a place to grow their food, to sell at the market, or to support their families. So our primary target audience in this behavior change campaign case study, and we will be publishing a book later this year with the Jane Goodall Institute, Impact by Design, and myself on how we did this with step-by-step, like a recipe. So you can keep an eye out for that. But our primary audience were small-scale farmers, subsistence farmers. So a big aha moment to all of us was that composting became the behavior change that we wanted to promote in this campaign. And it's a long story how we got there, but this worked really well because it was free, readily available materials are all over the place, and it addresses a lot of different issues for people. Like women don't have to travel so far to go to the forest to farm. It helps people build other mini supply chains that popped up. It water conservation, climate smart agriculture. It addressed so many issues, and it helped alleviate people's needs to go set up new farms in critical chimp habitat. So this wasn't a save the chimp, save the forest campaign. It became a composting campaign because of our theory of change in the background. So I'm just going to give you an example of one message we used a lot in this initiative that was meant to address both the client team and project teams' needs and goals and our target audience's goals of providing for their family. This messaging was designed iteratively and updated from the baseline through our pilot in 3 villages. Then we launched to 11 villages and we let that run for a while and did a midline evaluation and then an end of campaign evaluation. And so this was iteratively designed over time. But the key message of the campaign became this: you have everything you need around you to create your own compost, to improve your soil on your farm for bountiful crops next season. So that appealed to their efficacy, autonomy, and the fact that they would see results soon. We integrated a campaign slogan, Tunza Undongo, Tunza Familia, care for the soil, care for the family. We use metaphors to explain how the soil is kind of like our body and needs some of the same resources and rest and water. These were all designed with our target audience and integrated into the theater, mascots, school gardens, demonstration heaps, tutorials, et cetera, et cetera. And the highlights, there's so many because this was such a heavily evaluated a campaign. But we found that in the treatment villages compared to the controls, there was higher trust in Jane Goodall Institute. The farmers were maintaining the behavior for multiple farming seasons. They were more likely, even if they didn't compost, to believe it would be a really common practice in their communities. And we saw that a lot in the control villages too, once they knew what it was, because composting is not a common thing in this region. And they also said they knew of people who were stopping their farming practices in the chip habitat forest nearby. So that was really exciting. We triangulated this with soil for soil data and GIS support too, to see how forest deforestation trends were changing from treatment to control. So this is really exciting and cost less than the average environmental education and awareness campaigns that were happening in the area. So that was really exciting, but it took a long time to get there. And the interesting aha moment here that you'll see is this wasn't very chip forward, if you will, with the messaging. It was values first. What do the farmers need? And we had a lot of success and very proud of this campaign. Another one, which is a lot newer in its development stages, so that's another reason I wanted to select this, is with Keeping Forests, which works in 13 southern states. And it started in South Carolina, which is a really exciting pilot case study to me because that's where I'm from. So I had a deep understanding of the cultural values in that area. And the issue here is that there's a high conversion rate of forests to other uses like parking lots, housing, solar farms, and land getting divided up as it passes from generation to generation. And in the southeastern United States, 86% of these forests are owned by regular people like us that are just trying to make a living or recreate on their land that they've owned recently or for generations. So there's a lot of issues that lead to this problem, but one that we realize is that landowners are having a really hard time accessing the things they need to manage their forest and to make them work for them. So that can look like support in land management or burning or family like planning the generational transfer of land, things like that. And our original idea was a payment for ecosystem services program that adds a fee on a utility bill, like we've seen in other parts of the United States, and that money goes to forest and watershed conservation. So our target audiences here surprisingly became corporations. I'll share that in a moment. The landowners, and then the organizations that they trust, like the Farm Bureau, things like that, that are locally member-based organizations that they participate in. So a couple of things that were interesting here is it turned out not to be a payment for ecosystem service program, but instead our goal is to motivate corporate investment in a fund that compensates landowners for the benefits their forests provide all of us. How we got here is we learned that residents and utilities did not want to deal with another fee on their bills. And there weren't enough people on public utilities. A lot of people have wells in this area to make that work at scale. We also learned that corporations are already asking these landowner associations, utilities, and other people for things they can invest in to meet their sustainability goals. And we learned that the people that the forest landowners trust the most, which finding out who your target audience trusts is a very essential, very first step you need to take in any kind of behavior change initiative. They trusted local forestry experts and local landowner associations the most, as compared to like governments or something like that. So one of the messages, I'm going to share the same message reframed for two different audiences using the values we discovered in all of our research. The values you'll see are at the bottom that we tapped into. And here we're explaining that this fund was co-created with Southern landowners like them in mind, with the opportunity to help them keep their land forested, support their families' goals, and be recognized for the care they've always given the woods without adding a lot more, one more program they have to be part of. And even using that word woods instead of forest is important here because when I grew up, we didn't talk about forest, we talk about the woods. And words matter a lot when you're trying to create value-based messaging. So you want to keep those things in mind. A similar message reframed for our corporate staff that we're including in this co-creation process of what this fund can look like is like this. It's a blueprint for investment. You're helping design it. This will funnel your money into preserving natural infrastructure that supports your business while helping you deliver on risk reduction, brand identity, social license to operate. And so in this scenario, what we're essentially saying is rather than saying, if you build it, they will come, we're saying build it with us and then you'll already be there. And that's a big aspect of co-creation that I want to emphasize one more time. So in closing, there are two big aha moments I've had in my career working on behavior change and messaging design that's informed by target audiences and then created and refined with them. The first is that behavior change is not about persuading people, it's about partnering with people. And yes, you can motivate action and try to persuade with messaging, but that partnership is so important and co-creating is so important. I even keep a list of how it started, how it's going with all the campaigns I support, because most likely the solution you think is going to be what you promote with your campaign, or you know, the messaging you think you want to use is probably not going to end up being what your campaign is about once you really get into getting to know the audience and co-creating and refining that messaging with them. And that can be okay, because you can find those mutually beneficial solutions that work for both you and your target audience's needs. And as you can see from all the presenters today, psychology gives us amazing tools to use in the field of community-based conservation, but it's how we apply them that makes or breaks a campaign. So we need to have that cultural humility and be aware that what we traditionally, especially in like modern industrial nations, what we consider an expert isn't necessarily who the real experts are in a system and a community. We need to be really open-minded about that. And be open-minded that you might not be the best messenger in a community, and to take that creative approach to figuring out who they are so that you can find solutions that work for everyone involved. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Let's give Lauren, yes, some love. If you have any clarifying questions, if you have any quick questions, we have time for a couple. This isn't a clarifying question, but oh, here we go. We got one. What was your, I was going to say one that's a little more substantive, but I was going to ask, but we got a great one. What was your timeline for each of the projects? This person said, this is an anonymous attendee. I assume they took a while considering the trust building components. If that's the case, how did you attract and maintain funding over the course of the entire project? How did you keep your leadership or board on board with a project that evolves so much over time? Great question.
Really great question. So the Tanzanian project started in 2019. Some of the planning began before that, and it was funded by USAID. The first 5 years of funding. So it took about a year and a half to design the pilot, the messaging, get everything we needed done, graphic design to radio and theater produced. And then we did a pilot for about a year, I believe. And then we kept doing evaluation through this whole thing. And then the campaign and evaluation ran for 3 more years. And then we received funding to scale up to 57 more villages before USAID was unfortunately defunded, as it was this year. So that's the update I have on that one, unfortunately. Keeping people on board is a great question. One of the things I highly recommend if you're going to do any kind of behavior change initiative is to do training together with the implementation team and the leadership team on what is behavior change and what is not, because it's very different than raising awareness and educational initiatives. And it takes more time, it's a different process. And if everyone understands that and has the same language they're using, it makes projects work so much better. With the one in the southeastern United States, we've been working on that. It started with some funding from the Forest Service and South Carolina Forestry Commission. The original research lasted about a year and a half, and now we have IRA funding for 5 more years to scale up to 3 pilot sites in addition, or including South Carolina. We haven't decided for a new 3 or 4. And so that was because we keep the funders in the loop. When we have meetings, we ensure that they're open to the funder, the target audience, to interact with each other. The leadership and decision makers are all in the room together, so they are watching each other in real time, and have had so many powerful aha moments by having the funder right in front of a target audience member as they're sharing what their real life experience is. So I highly encourage that too, not to keep everybody siloed. Try to keep people having opportunities to hear from each other, so that we're not talking about each other as in like third person, or we don't really know each other. We can refer to like, oh, when that landowner shared this, that's why we're making this decision. So that's really helpful to keep people bought into the project too.
That's great. Yeah, and it sounds like really breaking down this distinction between who are the community versus the stakeholders, funders. There's that really breaking down and making this a collective effort. That's a big part of your process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's creating more level playing field on who's the expert in the room, and it not just always being conservationists. It's the community members. It's people who have done projects like this before that can speak to it. And sometimes it's just people who understand the culture and who people trust, like inviting in pastors or village leaders or, wildlife traffickers. I've held workshops with people everyone's scared of, from exotic pet owners on YouTube to wild meat sellers, and bringing those people to the room together isn't always something people think about doing, but it's super helpful and leveling that playing field on who's an expert and what, and who gets to help inform design.
I love that. Thank you so much. Great parting words for now from Lauren. We will get you back after our third speaker, who I'm so excited to introduce, Dr. Janet Swim. I'll just say Janet is one of my mentors, one of the people that got me involved in APA and Division 34 and realizing that there was so much potential to not just write journal articles, but have an impact on the world as a psychologist. So I'm thrilled to introduce her. I will move on to the written remarks. Janet is a psychology professor at Penn State University, associate director of the Penn State Climate Consortium, and fellow at Penn State University's Social Science Research Institute, facilitating research on social dynamics of environmental and climate change. She uses surveys and experimental studies to investigate the social and psychological foundations of pro-environmental actions. These foundations include emotions, perceived social norms, and reasons why we value nature. The actions range from individual adaptation and mitigation behaviors to policy support and participation in civic action. Fun fact about Janet, there are more four-footed animals in her house than two-footed right now. Their most recent addition is Dobby, an Alaskan Husky. He was originally a sled dog at a resort in Western Pennsylvania, but he didn't like it. He loves to run in the forest behind their home, which he does once or twice a day. So Janet, maybe during Q&A you can share a photo, but for now, why don't you pop up your slides and talk to us about your work? Looks great. All right, Janet, we can see your slides. You just need to unmute. Somebody has to talk while muted or else it wouldn't be a webinar.
Oops, that's me. All right, so now I'll go back to my slides again, which I now have to, okay. Now they might be off. Are they off now?
You just have to do you just have to do the slideshow view.
Yeah, okay. Now it's okay? No, not quite yet. Now?
We are in business. Take it away.
Okay. Okay, so yes, what I was saying was that I really appreciate APA and World Wildlife Foundation working together on it. I love both organizations, and it's such a nice way to form a partnership. And I want to thank Althea and Beth for all the work organizing us and the staff at APA and World Wildlife Foundation, because it's just a great opportunity. So what I'm going to be doing is specifically focusing on water policy support. And I think I find these findings I align with other policies because some of these actually originated with some of my work on climate change policies. And then for this particular grant funding, we were looking at water policies. The data are mostly from the United States on this particular part of the grant. So in the US, the Clean Water Act protected water in 1972. Yet there still remains a variety of threats to the quality and quantity of clean water in the United States. This is from widespread PFAS in our water from plastics, excess nitrogen from fertilizers and aging septic systems. These threats are made worse by climate change, like when nitrogen is into the water, you get more algae growth, you get more algae, you get less oxygen in the water, you're hurting fish, you're hurting things all around the water site. So we still have threats, even though some people think we don't because of the 1972 Clean Water Act. It is the case so that the US publicly has consistently been concerned about water quality. Yet it's also the case when policies come up, people don't necessarily support the policies themselves. So this is a classic attitude behavior, lack of connection or values not leading to particular behaviors. So what we're doing in our research is trying to make this distinction between what people might think generally versus what they might think specifically. So if you think about these two targets here, they represent a policy or a set of policies, if you want, or a policy. And the one on the left represents efforts to predict support with general findings and beliefs, such as how close you are to nature or you're concerned about water quality. So what I'm having here is that the arrows are getting close to the target and they may or may not hit it. And the other one, though, is when you start thinking about specifically about their feelings and thoughts about the policy itself, you're going to get a closer connection. I was thinking about this when Sonia had her triangle. And you've got values at the outer end and you get behaviors at the very tip. And so values can filter their way into these behaviors, but in the middle were these attitudes and norms, and they're more closely connected. And so the more closely connected they are to the outcome that you're interested in, the better able you are to predict it. So a lot of our research on these policies are about thoughts and feelings about the policies themselves. So my collaborators and I have been examining feelings and thoughts about these policies. The next slides, you will see the icons for these things. And so we're looking about emotions about the policies, thoughts about the policies, and perceived social context. And so in the first study, we specifically addressed this difference between emotions about water quality versus emotions about water policies. And in this, we studied 4 emotions. We studied hope, anxiety, anger, and we call it neutral emotions. So we considered hope because a lot of attention has been given to hope. Many people wanting people to be more hopeful and thus presumably more willing to take actions. We were actually uncertain about whether hope about water quality would make a difference because hope is pretty much an ambiguous feeling in terms of water quality and other problems itself. Because some people may say they're hopeful because they don't think they have to do anything, things will be fine. Or they're hopeful that if they just wait long enough, something will happen. Other people might be hopeful because their efforts could matter. And so we weren't actually sure if you just ask about hope about water quality, what we'd end up with. Hope about water policies themselves, though, is much more connected to the policy itself, making us more confident that the more hopeful you are about the policy, the more you would like the policy. Anxiety anxiety and related emotions have been a focus a lot because of people's concern about environmental problems. And generally, messages have been used to make people realize why they should be concerned about water quality, and have used those to help people, be more willing to support actions to address water quality. However, you can think about, though, that anxiety about the policy itself would have the opposite effect. If you're anxious about the policy, you might not want it. Anger is an approach emotion, often studied as a predictor of collective action. And so likewise, if you're angry about water quality, you might be supportive of water policies. But if you're angry about the policy itself, you might not want that policy. Neutral emotions is a new research area by my colleague Karen Gasper. It's not the same thing as being ambivalent. One can feel more or less neutral, independent of whether or not you have positive or negative feelings, and they can co-occur with positive and negative feelings, or it's just separate. And we thought that if you're neutral about water quality or the water policy, you think, well, whatever, I don't really care. I'm not that supportive. But we also thought that the emotions about the policies would be better able to predict policy support than emotions about water quality. And that's back to that correspondence, since I got those targets at the top there. So what we did in this first study I'm going to talk about, we first asked people to report their emotions about water quality in their state with those 4 types of emotions. Then they read 10 different policies. They ranged from requiring septic system upgrades to stormwater fees to conservation easements. We picked these based upon some other research we've done in the country and in the New Hampshire, which is the origins of some of this research. So then in our study, after they saw each policy description, they gave their emotions and their support for the policy. And here we have the first set of results. This is, again, this very general concerns about water quality didn't predict support very well. The only one was neutral emotions. With the more neutral, they didn't support the policies, but the emotions didn't matter. So when you get to the emotions about the policies themselves, they're better predictors. People who feel hopeful supported the policy, while those who felt angry, anxious, or neutral did not. And hope was the strongest predictor. But I also want to point out, we also did these within person analyses. So this is not people who feel hopeful, but it's the policies that generated more hope, less anger, and less anxiety were supported more than policies that did the difference. So practically this last association is informative because people don't support policies equally. So sometimes you can find people who like one water policy more than another water policy, and it's not whether or not they support water policies themselves. And methodologically, the within-person analyses removes individual differences like political identity or some other third variable, maybe even values, because they're within the person itself, and the person's values are constant when you do the within-person analyses. So then the next part is what type of information might improve policy support? And here we were thinking about policy outcomes. And so this is a different study. When we think about outcomes, policies have both intended and unintended effects. So these water policies have the intention to clean water and improve the environmental conditions. But when you go into the communities themselves, when you look at it, so one of the communities has trying to have stormwater fees to address the concentrated discharge, what's called concentrated discharge. When water rains really hard or snow melts, it sweeps off all the pollutions on the road, concentrates them, and the natural soils can't filter them very well. And they get into the groundwater, get into rivers and streams and pollute water. But the opposition to it had a campaign called Stop the Rain Tax. And they talked about it as a personal tax, and it suggests an economic impact for why people didn't want the policy. And then we also have the conservation easements, and this is where people who are landowners can agree to not develop their land. So if they have forests, it'll stay a forest. They have farms, it'll stay a farm, although it could become more forested. But the practical consequence is that rich people have the land, or they're buying the land, and they're getting a lot of tax credits. And the opposition, in some sense, one of the opposition is that poor people don't have this land, and it's rich people are making profits off of their land, off of their where they live, and getting tax benefits. And so it becomes an unfair social benefit. So the point here is there are economic and social consequences that people think about in addition to the environmental consequences of any policy. So in this particular study, this was in New Hampshire, a very local area who was considering these policies. They had 3 policies. They were the stormwater fee policy, conservation easement policy, and also another one that they're considering their requirement to upgrade people's septic systems. So after each policy, they named the 3 positive and 3 negative consequences they thought about, and then how negative or positive it was and how likely was it to emerge. So we have outcome beliefs, or the valence rating, the negative or positive, weighted by how likely what is it. So they might think it's very positive, but it's not very likely. Or they think it's negative and it's not likely, or they may think it's positive and very likely. So we're trying to keep in count both how positive and negative it is and whether it's going to emerge. And then they wrote both the feelings on the same 4 emotions and asked about whether they supported it or not. So these are the results. The more and they're within subjects here. So the more people believed a policy had these positive outcomes, the more hope and less anxious they felt about those policies. And like the other study, hope and more hope led to more support of a policy, and less anxiety led to less support. So these are, in some sense, the origins of these emotions that we looked at in the first study are about these outcome beliefs. But we also wanted to look at these comments people rated. And so we did some qualitative coding of them. And what we found was when people listed positive things, they were almost like 3/4 of them were environmental. So they thought about biodiversity, quality of the environment, the water source itself, more so than the orange represents social and economics. So they thought about the environment when they thought about positive things. But when they listed negative things, few thought about negative environmental impacts, which some people do talk about with environmental policies, but they're most likely to be thinking about negative economic things. That's some of it's their own personal resources, but some of it is also that the town will not have as much money depending on the policy. And then there's these other social consequences about health. So the harms they thought about were you can't have the urban development they felt that their community wanted. They thought it was unfair. They thought they'd lose freedoms. They thought, actually, some people thought the health would be worse. And they also thought, which I think is interesting for some social norm part of it, is that they thought it'd create division in their community by raising concerns and raising anger if the policy were passed. So we also looked at whether these thoughts that they had, this qualitative coding, affected policy support. So we take the difference between the number of positive and negative things they listed. And so the more positive environmental things predicted support. But importantly, these other things did as well. So the more positive social they had, and over the negative social, they liked it better. But if they thought there was more negative social than positive, then they would like it less, and which is what we have. So it's because it's a positive correlation. And the same with economic. Most people thought there was more negative economic than positive, and so with that, they would support it less. So all three of these things are contributing to policy support. But within the same study, we also wanted to know the social context. And here we're considering, it's called subjective norm beliefs as the social context. So these norm beliefs are a combination of the beliefs about how much other people support and oppose the policies, and how close they are to those people who support and oppose the policies. So in that same study, you could put these subjective norms in, and it has the same impact, independent of the outcome beliefs. That if you feel that if you're close to groups that support the policy, you have hope for it and you don't have anxiety for it. But if you're close to people who oppose the policy, you don't have hope and you are more anxious. And then hope and anxiety have the same pathway over. And we also then looked at what are the groups that they were talking about. So the people they thought would support the policies were scientists at the nearby university, environmental groups, the EPA, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the people who would oppose it would be neighbors, friends, and family. And you can guess that the people that they're closer to are the people who oppose it. So it's important to think about the social context, but who they are referencing in the social context for when they're thinking about the policies. So just to sum up, specifying the target of people's feelings and beliefs is critical for identifying predictors of particular policy support and preferences among those policy. It's also important for topic areas where people are already concerned, and those were people who are not concerned. So actually in this study in New Hampshire, people were not concerned about water quality, but their opinions about the policies themselves make a difference. And you can think about climate change. You might think that we need to get people concerned about it, climate change, but that doesn't guarantee that they're going to like the policy that you come up with. And it's also possible that if there are positive social consequences for a policy, it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not they're concerned about climate change if they think about some of the positive aspects of the policy unrelated to it. So we're trying to get to very specifically these sort of targets, predictors of the target, the policy itself. And so here we find that emotions about the policy were better predictors than emotions about the water quality itself. And hope was particularly strong predictor. Anxiety and anger contributed as well to policy support. Thoughts about the policies contribute. These are the environmental consequences, what people might be thinking about with the environment, but what they think about the social and economic outcomes are as important as well. And all three of them contribute to policy support. And then it's the context important. What people close to us think can influence what we think about the policies. And so the last point I want to just emphasize here, because the other presenters talked about co-creation, and I really respect that and think that's really critical, that sometimes when people see these results, they think that I'm trying to figure out how to create the best social message. And I think that's part of it, but I think it's knowing your audience. But it's also the idea that once you have identified these sort of things, that you can go in and have better conversations with people. You might be listening for people who are anxious or angry. You might be thinking that you're trying to talk about the environment, but what they want to hear is the social and economic consequences. And so it's a way to have better conversations with people. It's also when you get to that point, which is also liked in some of the previous ones, is that you may start with a particular policy, but you may shift the policy itself based upon the conversations you have, if you know what you're listening for, and listening for some of these things, and there are other things as well, I'm sure. So I wanted to thank people. These are the students that really helped me work on this, and my colleagues, and the people who supported this research. Okay, that's it.
All right. All right. Yes, thank you. Round of applause for Janet. Any quick clarifying questions for Janet? Otherwise, I'm going to invite all of the speakers back. I'm gonna, one question just came in. I think that when a policy affects a person's well-being, it is likely to be linked to their emotions, isn't it? So they're asking about when a policy affects a person's well-being specifically, is it more linked to their emotions than if it's not? And so, since we'll start with you, Jana, on that one, and then I'll invite Lauren and Sonia to join us back on screen, and we'll just move into our broad Q&A.
Well, it depends on, I'm trying to think about what you mean the emotions. So yes, that's actually what we found is that when people think about a certain sort of outcome, which would include it's going to be good for my health, then they're going to feel more hopeful about it. But if they think it's not good for their health, they're going to feel more anxious about the policy. Now, it's possible to have a broader sense as well, is that I may generally feel more hopeful about the problem going backwards from the problem, but not the policy itself. So it really is what we were thinking about yet, but that's one of the point of our second study is that the emotions, the thoughts, and the social context really are important for the thoughts and for the feelings themselves.
Awesome. Yeah, and it sounds like the question makes me think a little bit about like construal level theory, this idea of psychological distance, that the more it affects, the more the policy relates to a person's well-being, the closer it is to us, the more we have an emotional as opposed to a cognitive response, which I think there is significant research that suggests that. So I'm going to invite Sonia. Yeah, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I was just thinking about that's where in some sense we got to neutral emotions. The neutral emotions then are like meh. That's where the like whatever. And it doesn't affect me. I don't really care. And in fact, I really don't care a lot. And so we got into that, and that was a lot about. We did find it to be more about the problem than the solution, and I'd like to explore that more. Basically, and my colleague Karen Gasper is really diving into this idea of whatever, and that could probably be more likely the more distant the problem is seen.
Yeah. Lauren or Sonia, before we move on, we have so many questions. I'm going to do my best. So just so you know out there in the audience, I'm going to grab as many questions as I can. We are, I promise, not getting to all of them because you've been so rich with all the things. But Lauren and Sonia, any thoughts on that? This idea of like personal relevance, emotion, and likelihood to engage?
Well, on the distance bit, I mean, both psychological and physical distance seem to keep coming up over and over and over again when it comes to driving environmental behavior. With the Ganga work I talked about, the further away you were from the river, and this was from the online survey, the more likely you were to see it as polluted. The wildfire, the same kinds of things keep coming up. So the further you are from like the nexus of a wildfire, your kind of orientations towards what you think of as important, which kind of makes sense, change. So distance, I think, is a really key and possibly still underexplored factor.
Yeah, I don't have anything much more brilliant to add than they have, but one thing that I've noticed with our work with Keeping Forests is that concept of watershed. You can be proximally very close and in it, but very far from it if you don't understand what a watershed is and how you connect to it. So just playing around with those words to help people understand that play space can help with some of that emotional connection too.
I wanted to point again is that what I was trying to get at here is even if you feel close to it and you feel there's a risk, if you don't like the policy, that can still be an interference. So you can feel really close, but like the idea that in the southeastern part of the United States, they didn't want to have yet another bill. And so you have to come up with something else. And so they can feel like the water is important, or it's close, but it really comes down to some of the fights are about the policies.
Yeah. I'm going to start throwing in a couple more kind of mechanisms or like into this conversation by way of questions from the audience. So a couple people asked about at the intersection of kind of values, beliefs, and norms. I'm going to ask two. How far do you consider the intersection of personal values and peer influence in impacting one's behavior? And then I'm going to add in another question. How can one use real social networks research for understanding collective action? maybe start, I feel like all of you could have something to say on that, but like Sonia, on this idea of the intersection in norms and influence, do you have any initial thoughts on that one?
Well, it kind of gets into what we think of as values. So if you buy what I was proposing of values being kind of early forms, something that almost emerges in childhood, then it kind of makes it seem like they would be less resistant to norms and peer influence. And it might be really critical to start getting children to engage with conservation types of activities, because that's where the real values are being formed, like early on. So how do we bring a lot of these parent-child dyad kind of studies in and start to think about how environmental values are forming? I remember with my own kids, like they would see SUVs and, no disrespect to any SUV driver out there, but I personally, don't care for them very much. And the children would be like, well, why do we have such a small car? Like, why can't we get a big SUV? And early on, we had these conversations about like, where do we stand in the world and what do we think of as environmental thought and behavior? And I wonder if those values get formed and then they are less resistant. And there may be broad values and specific values, and that's something that we talked about in the IPBES work. And it could be that these broader values are less resistant to change, but specific values are more context dependent and can be shifted with changing norms and peer influence.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a follow-up question about youth and children, a couple in a second. Before I do, Lauren and Janet, any other thoughts on this, throwing in this idea of peer influence, social networks, social norms? Like, how can we leverage peer influence and network effects?
So I think it's I was going to just say also with the values part, I think that the values can influence, like when we're doing our work, is how positive or negative an outcome is. And so if values don't directly go to your sport, it's because it's influencing how you evaluate the thing in front of you. And peers I think, are critical for what things we think are important. And I think that when we do a lot of research on social norms, but I think it's really the tip of an iceberg for social influence processes that we really need to be thinking more, both at the interpersonal level. Nicole Sintoff is doing some great work on this, and how other people around us affect how we even talk about it, which is some of the things that Nathan and I have done, that the more support you have for something, the more hopeful you are about that thing. But I also want to point out that networks are not just at the individual level, that we're at Penn State, we're trying to find networks of businesses and NGOs. And so how do groups form networks as well as networks within the organizations as well?
Yeah. And you're talking about Nicole's work, kind of, she's looking at married couples decisions to buy, like that kind of research, like how our deepest relationships are impacting our choices.
Yeah, and the content of people's conversations.
Yes. Yeah.
And what is it you're talking about? So we used to say, well, people should talk about climate change, and my colleague said, well, what do you want me to say? And so it's really what is in those conversations is important to understand, that we have a group of students where we encourage to talk about climate change, and then sometimes they work and sometimes they didn't. And I think it's becomes what they actually end up saying in those conversations.
Lauren, I'm going to turn over to you. I know you had talked a lot about kind of stakeholders and building groups, so you can comment on that, but I'm going to throw in on the topic of values, one more question that came in. How do you influence coexistence with wildlife to protect an endangered species when deeply rooted values conflict with science?
Well, that's the root of a lot of emails and phone calls I get when it's time to work on a new project. I feel like is this like, oh, there's this conflict between what they want the client and what the community is doing, or what they think the community values. So I guess like part of this is, it might not be so much that the values conflict with science, the behaviors and values might conflict with our mission and what we hope is happening in an area. But I think it goes to the point of like, one of the best ways to influence people is to build relationships. And so that means sometimes reframing are like, oh, why do their values conflict with what I want? Why are they killing an animal? Why don't they love the species? Or what do we do here? Is to reframe it and think about it like, what do I need to learn about this group of people's values to help me work with them better and to help meet their needs, and letting go of our needs so much and putting them so front and center, which yes, your mission might be to save wildlife, but you still have to step back and figure out what are the community's needs that are leading to the behaviors that you see. Because sometimes we assume that behaviors are representative of a value set when they're not. Yes, they're the outward expression of what someone might value, but that can get really complicated if we don't dig in more to figure out what's driving those behaviors. So yeah, I think, and to keep in mind that it can be, in my opinion, unethical to try to change people's values, and in certain instances, we need to be very mindful of that. So I would say, just to reframe the question of, is it really that their values conflict with science, or is it that their behaviors conflict with what you know to be the best way to save this species? And maybe there's a new idea we haven't thought of yet that could address that coexistence issue. And I think the chimpanzee composting case study is a really good example of that, because people are really scared of chimps. They're dangerous for people's crops and children. And we found a way to find those co-benefits without having to put JGI's mission so front and center in all the messaging.
Awesome. I'm going to move into a couple questions on specific audiences. We're going to get to kids in a second. Sonia already kind of brought that up. But since you were just talking about kind of folks who work in nature and environment, do you have any, and this might be anyone, but I think, Lauren, you have some experience in this, to engage with individuals who may have a negative view of environmentalism, and specifically any advice on how to positively affect environmental attitudes and behaviors among farmers and ranchers?
Yeah, I can touch on that and then turn the mic over. I think one of the hardest things sometimes for people who are trying to work with a community or start a new program, especially if it's in a place they haven't worked a lot, is that realizing you might not be the best messenger to interact with a community. Yes, you might be the person with that job title, but that might not necessarily mean you're the right person to go work with a target audience or community on that co-creation, and that's okay. I think one of the first steps is to start to figure out who the people you want to interact with trust, and work with them first. So I mentioned earlier, working with influencers that were promoting tons of exotic pet ownership and bringing them in early, even though, like, as a neutral third party, I could do that for my client in that instance. So finding people that can help you bring in the people that are actually trusted and good messengers for the audience you want to influence. Meet with them right away at the very beginning, explain what you're trying to do, find your blind spots, find your biases. And keeping in mind that the words that you normally use, like watershed, forest, instead of like woods and things like this, might not be the right words that just flag you instantly as being an outsider. And so thinking about what are the local words that are best to use, and using those words and messengers to figure out how to bring them to the table. Another thing too, of engaging with groups and individuals who might have a negative view of environmentalism, too, is compensate them for their time. Be respectful. Be like, look, I know that maybe our missions don't align here. I want to stop exotic pet ownership. You are making millions promoting it, but here's what I'm trying to do. I will pay you for your insight. I've done this. I've had them help me with surveys and interview guides, and compensate people for bringing them to the table, even if you don't like them or agree with them, because the best way to diffuse your ideas and the behaviors is to work with the people that your audience trusts, not just go ahead and lead the way because that might be your role you normally take in a project like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Janet and Sonia, anything else on this, and any strategies or advice? I'm throwing in another question on the same topic, trying to get through as many as I can. Any other strategies and advice for communicating with groups that do not prioritize pro-environmental behavior? How do we talk to people who might not believe?
I think this is a really relevant issue for the Forest Service, right? Like, which often comes into conflict with ranchers in particular, right? So like, even with like predator reintroduction, that's a huge issue for ranchers. And it really, really gets to the core of why value sensitive governance is so critical. And Lauren, like, I think you're completely right that if you can reframe ecological goals in culturally resonant terms, right, for both groups, it's just absolutely critical to understand that it's not like one set of value orientations are necessarily more pro-environmental than another set of value orientations. Like, right? People may come to something from an anthropocentric worldview, but really engage in all sorts of pro-environmental behaviors, right? And similarly, it's not just that the biocentric value orientations are the ones that are more environmentally construed. So like, you know, surfacing and like legitimizing those multiple value systems is so critical. And all of the work on sacred values tells us that acknowledgement of people's values is like a critical and remarkable first step to minimizing moral outrage and minimizing conflict. So when it comes to things that are really sacred for people, if you just tell them to suppress it or you just don't acknowledge it, that is almost one of the worst things that you could do when values are coming into conflict.
Thank you. I'm going to, because I've said I was going to a couple of times, I'm going to ask, and I'm not sure how much research this group has done specifically, but any thoughts on evidence-based strategies for working with children in K-12 settings and or applying findings to motivate students or even form pro-environmental school clubs at the K-12 and or college level? Any thoughts on that?
I can chime in a little here because I did my dissertation on building conservation ethic in students in the 4th grade to high school age range. And that's a whole nother thing. I'm happy to share that resource. It was essentially, God, how do you distill down a 300-page document into like one sentence or two? But repeated exposure to programs is really helpful, especially when there was a problem-based or project-based approach and not just information transfer. Even if they couldn't get out in the field, having a project and problem-based approach helps a lot with building the 21st century skills people need to address environmental problems. So I'll leave that there and I'll share the paper for later.
Awesome. Anything else on that? I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna kind of take, because we're running low on time. There's a couple questions I want to make sure I get in. I wanted to ask about where all of you do work with actual organizations that are on the ground implementing. What are any mistakes you see organizations make frequently when trying to apply behavioral science in conservation? Are there any like just common pitfalls that you've seen in your work?
Not thinking of communication as a two-way street. So how can we get people to do this, right? Or how do we like build support for a particular perspective and just not hearing the input from the other side? Like even when it came to the public comments work that I talked about, like the fact that we don't think of public comments as a meaningful source of people telling us what they deeply hold dear to themselves. Like it just seems crazy. Like it just seems like how we treat it is like a chore. All right, we just got to get through all of these public comments. But no, people spend a lot of time telling you what they think. So yeah, I'd say that's probably number one for me.
One that tying onto that, Sonia, too, is like people having meetings when people can't be there. Like only doing the work during your normal business hours does not work for community engagement. You have to think about removing barriers to engaging with your target audiences, like helping pay for them to be there, offering childcare, providing hotspots so they can come to Zoom meetings, making that two-way street to communicate easier for them, especially if it's to meet your organization's goals. I think that's one that I don't see a lot.
I was just gonna do a story that when we first started doing some things with conversations, we had students meet together with community groups. And after, in the middle of the conversation, the farmer said, "I know more about farming than you do." And it was just a real defensive response. And it's like the assumption that people were making without listening to the farmer themselves. So the farmer does know a lot about what's happening to the farm. And so it's really a sense of respecting. And I think what Sonia would say, this sort of humility and also recognizing what they know, the knowledge sources of what they know. And I'd also say, I was thinking what you were saying, Lauren, when we first started doing, when I was in graduate school, health work, we would have little information sessions, but you have to go where they are. And both cognitively or psychologically, but in some sense physically, that if you have a session and nobody shows up, well, it's because they have to go out of the way to get to you So if you can figure out how to go to them, and Zoom can be a possibility, but we also did one Zoom thing where we were trying to interact with the church, and they only had one Zoom. This is way back in COVID. And the pastor was at the Zoom translating what we would say to the audience, and it just didn't work at all. So we couldn't hear the audience. We could only hear it filtered through that guy. And he was great. He was trying to be really supportive, but it was really not set up well. And sometimes you do have to be face to face if you can.
Thank you. So we're gonna try and ask one last quick question. So final thoughts, and then I'm gonna turn over to Althea to close us. About you all, Janet, you talked a lot about hope. I feel like we spent a lot of our careers in a time where we were trying to convince people of climate change, and now that's not going away, but there's a lot of like anxiety and climate grief, and when we're feeling impacts. So what strategies are there to move people past a feeling that we're not making a difference, that we can't? How do we cultivate hope in the face of seemingly irreversible and imminent climate change? And how do we communicate the urgency of action in a way that provokes action and not anxiety or paralysis? So that's a tiny question. I'm sure you can all address that in 30 seconds or so, but any final thoughts on how do we move forward and engage people with hope?
So I've thought a lot about this, but I think again, I'd go back to hope about the problem versus hope about the solutions, and getting into the efficacy about what can be done. And that's where it actually becomes difficult, when the climate makes you think the solutions can't be done. And I also think I would be more precise about hope in a sense. Maybe what we actually mean is inspiration, or maybe we mean courage. Maybe we don't actually mean hope. Hope may be just too ambiguous. There may be something more fundamental, I don't know, something different than hope and inspiration. Or I think about like gateway emotions, and like self-transcendence gets people into it, but you still have to translate that into hope about the solution itself. So getting people to the table with their emotions could be in terms of transcendence and inspiration, courage, but getting them to do the solution is hope about the solutions.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, all our speakers. I'm going to turn the last word over to our host from WWF, Althea. Thank you all. If you feel like throwing some reactions, one more round of very virtual applause for our speakers, and I'll turn over to you.
Thank you so much to our amazing moderator and panelists. Please do show them some love. And thanks also to each and every one of you for joining today. I hope you've enjoyed the presentations and panelist insights as much as I have. Personally, I'm taking away a few things. One, that people's values form the foundation of decision-making that affects the environment. Second, that positive, value-first, co-created messaging, often with local experts and their trusted partners, is most effective in influencing pro-environment behaviors. And finally, that garnering public support for environmental policies requires us to understand people's social contexts, their beliefs about social and economic outcomes, and their emotions about proposed solutions. So I want to conclude by sharing that while this was the last webinar in this series on psychology and forests, it doesn't mark the end of collaboration between WWF and APA. Our organizations are in the process of exploring a longer-term strategic partnership to pursue our joint vision of a healthy and sustainable future where people and nature flourish. You will receive a brief survey to complete after today's session. We really value your feedback and will use it to shape that future programming. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.